Okay, so we're going to go for reassembling the gears back into the gearbox. So we've got these two gears that are going to go onto the main shaft sleeve, and we have the lay shaft assembly with its gears on it, and we have the selector fork. So we'll put the selector fork on the lay shaft, wider end goes in, and if we remember, the smaller gear towards the outside. Now what we need to do is slide these in and try to wiggle things slightly so that these pins engage with the selector arm. So getting everything wiggled in, it's tight for space, but it's definitely possible. So I'm going to try and get the splines on this upper gear aligned with the main shaft sleeve. There we are. We've managed to wiggle the selector fork into the gearbox, and once it's all in past the lip, it's best to let the lay shaft droop slightly, because we're going to have to engage it into these fork ends as we advance it forwards. That's got it. So now we need to get the end of the lay shaft into its bushing, for which we'll need these gears properly meshed. Which they're not doing just at the moment. There we go, that's them meshed, and we should be able to now get the end of the lay shaft into its bushing. And obviously this is great fun because we can't see what we're doing. Right. No, that's not it. I thought that was maybe it, but it's not. This is tricky. It shouldn't be tricky, but that felt like a very positive move. There. So you'll feel when it's gone. And what I now want to do is put the main shaft back in. And just oil that off camera. Right, so that's got a film of oil on, and so now the main shaft should slide back through. And what I want to do is make sure that that engages with the clutch basket, because I've been a bit lazy. Right, so that's now going in through the end of my clutch basket. So what I'm going to do is just turn you off briefly, and I'll go and just tighten up the clutch nut to pull all of this in. Right, so that's the clutch nut. It's not fully home yet, but it's just holding things in place. So as I'm looking in here, you can see I've got my gears meshed together, and they won't fully change because we're not rotating the engine. But if I turn the wheel, the gears are turning. It's, broadly speaking, doing what it's supposed to do. There we go. Those gears have slid along their shaft there. So the next step is a bit of a fiddle, which involves putting the gear case back on, I thought I would just go over this striker plate assembly again. So this is the striker plate where the kickstart shaft goes in that I said not to move, and there's the kickstart shaft. As you can see, that pole is sitting out, it's on a sprung pin, and when it rotates and hits the striker, it's pushed back out of the way, and that's the kickstart in the up position when it's not being used. When you move it down, that comes out and catches in these notches to turn the engine with a kickstart. The position of this is very difficult to set. There's a lot of trial and error. I started using actual feeler gauges in there of different thicknesses to try to get that distance set right. It's an absolute nightmare to do, so if you don't have to do it, leave it alone. But otherwise, well, just be aware it'll take you a while. So I've got the kickstart shaft installed in the outer casing with the pole retracted. The next bit, you need sort of 3 hands. We've got to get the end of the lay shaft in here, the end of the main shaft in here, and the end of the gear selector in here, all the while not losing the gasket off the face. So it can be a bit interesting. What I'm going to do is install the gasket and take it from there. And whilst I know you're not supposed to grease gaskets, I'm going to grease the gasket because effectively it needs gluing on. And I'm not too worried about any of this grease. I'm using the moly grease. A bit of molybdenum inside the gearbox certainly isn't going to do it any harm. Okay, so that's my gasket surface greased, and I'm going to stick the paper gasket to the surface. Try and line the holes up. This one came out of a set from India, so I wouldn't be surprised if it does line up pretty well. That's not bad. I've had some poor ones before, but that's not terrible. Okay, it's a bit tight, but I think that'll do. So yeah, we've got 3 things to get into position all at the same time. So let's have a go at it. What I find is if you can generally get the shafts in first, and then you can rotate this from the outside to catch the end of the gear selector. Because it's caught the ends of the shafts before it's engaged the gear selector, and you can kind of look down from the top as you advance it into position. Right, I've had a bit of a fault with the camera, it ran out of memory, so I've wound up skipping ahead very slightly. We were just talking about not tightening these screws fully down because there's a certain amount of slop due to the absence of dowels. I've put the clutch back on and I've torqued this reverse thread nut on the main shaft to 47 foot-pounds. So there was the it looks like an oil flinger, but there's no oil to fling. The sort of washer thing, and the lock washer, then the nut, tightened to 47 foot-pounds, and then bent the tab back over on that nut. What I like to do then is install the plunger, the tent, and you'll find that this is sometimes a bit fiddly as well. It's all got to line up, so this is again helping pull those gear cases into alignment. And if we remember that the tent needs to be lined up so that the slot is parallel with the ground, that means the detent is engaging with the internal gear selector. So once I've got that in place, main shaft done up, what I then like to do is grab the kickstart and turn it over a couple of times. Now what this will do, it will turn all the gear shafts. Okay. And because it's turned the gear shafts, it'll hopefully let this find the alignment it wants. Once we've got it aligned, then I can tighten these screws. Now I've already tightened them, as I say, because the battery, the memory card was full. We missed it, but I've tightened all of these down, and I'm just saying, whilst there is a torque setting for these, because they're going into aluminium, it's far better to tighten these by feel rather than by torque. I'm quite happy to get the correct torque setting for the main shaft nut. That's steel nut going onto a steel thread, and frankly, if it strips, it means there was something wrong with it that I couldn't make it tight enough. So now we've got main shaft done up, we've got the pawl installed, but not really tightened down particularly. We'll set that later, and we've got all these screws done up. So that's the outer gear case on, and we can start reassembling the rest of it. So the next thing I'm going to put on is the cover for the main shaft. That covers the bearing, stops grot getting in, and it would have been much better if I hadn't dropped that. Bear with me. That's recovered it. So it stops muck getting into the bearing. Now I actually have a sealed bearing on this one, so that's not such a big concern, and I'm not as worried about the condition of this O-ring. But if you have an open bearing there, you need this O-ring to be, this O-ring to be in good condition, so that oil can't leak out past the bearing. You'll see there's a little notch on this, which lines up with a notch on the casting, and I'll just screw this in to hold it down. Not tightening it all the way, just enough to hold it in place. And the next step is going to be the kickstart spring, which is held in with another screw there. So the kickstart spring, if we rotate the kickstart into its fully up position, there's a hole in this shoulder. There it is. So there's a hole there that this tang goes into, like so. And we need to tension the spring, and that's then held in position by this screw. And we screw that in. It can be a bit awkward to get it started because the spring's trying to pull it cross-threaded, so I'm putting quite a lot of tension on it with my thumb to hold it straight as I start it off. Once it's started, you're usually pretty straightforward to get that in place. Come on. Get in there. Nearly there. And again, brain engaged as you're tightening these because they're threaded into alloy. And knit this one up. That's good. Right, now I'm going to put the gear shift mechanism, the external gear shift mechanism. So we'll have this plate with the two springs and the slotted holes. So that goes over the boss and wiggles into place. That's it there. So we have these two posts. They screw in. We'll tighten them down just off finger tight, so it's holding the plate down but not preventing me from rotating it for adjustment later. There we go. Right, we have our selector arm, and this tab goes in between these two springs, like that. And the next bit's the ratchet. So inner ratchet, still nice and greasy, so that engages with the selector arm, and that engages with the spring. Sorry, the other way around. That engages with the spring, that engages with the selector arm. So that's on. We have the inner ratchet with the boss facing the outside over the square shaft. That's in place. And then we have the stopper plate, which goes over those two studs, and the thrust washer, and then we have our washers and half nuts that we used before. And we are nearly in a position to see if this thing is going to select some gears. Right, so I'm going to try it rotated all the way anti-clockwise to start with, and we'll tighten down the posts. If I can find the flats, it'll be here somewhere. I think I need spanner the other way around. There we go. There we go. Right, so posts are nipped down. Just nip down our little half nuts. And we'll get our gear selector, which is around here somewhere. Gear selector, just pop that on temporarily. And a spanner to do it up with. Okay, and let's see if we're getting some gears. Now we'll need to set the tension on this pawl. It's probably better too loose than too tight. If you find it's jumping out of gears very easily, then you might want to just tighten that up. But are on the side of looser rather than tighter. We'll just see how this is functioning. So we're in gear. I think we're possibly in first, so let's try for neutral. Right, that's neutral, or at least a neutral. See if we can change up. There's a gear. Excellent. Now, was that the right gear? Right, so we're not really changing properly there. I think there is one potential issue, is that... Okay, the more observant of you may have noticed that I'm overdue a cup of tea. This can go in one of two ways. And if you watch that ratchet, you see I've put it on the long slope of the ratchet. So it's just slipping off. That inner ratchet should be 180 degrees round from where I just fitted it. And then the pawls will engage with it properly, the outer ratchet will engage with it properly. So, time for a cup of tea. Okay, now we've got that sorted out, I've put that stop plate back on, and just feeling on the lever, I'm a bit too tight on this pawl, so I'll just back that off a bit. Okay, so we're in a gear. Okay, that's neutral. Okay, that was a very positive change into first, almost a bit too positive, but we'll see. Okay, back into neutral. There's second. There's third. Now, are we hitting a stop? Not quite. I think we might be in fourth actually. Fourth. Third. No. Neutral. Okay. What's that? Is that first? Okay, first. No. Okay, that feels like first. So that's neutral. So that would make that second, that third, and that fourth. Yes, success. Third, second, I think I'm over shifting down. So we're now at a point where we can start an adjustment process, which is a relief. So let's see where we're at with this. Loosen, loosen. And I think we're all the way that way. So let's go to halfway on our adjustment. Okay, let's see what we're doing. Okay, pretty sure that's first. And that was second, so first. No, that's changing That's a very positive upshift anyway. And I think that's fourth because I can turn it over compression with the wheel. So fourth. Neutral, huh? Strange. There's a gear. There's another gear. I think that was first, so that's neutral. Second, third, and fourth. Third, second, I think we're in first. Neutral. Okay, I think that's close enough to test it on the road. We seem to be getting all the gears. This may need tweaking again, but we're getting very close. Right, we're getting close to the point where we're going out for a road test. So I will get the rest of this reassembled. I'm going to take the gear lever back off. I think the pawl is pretty close to where I want it, so well, it can't be because it won't tighten down with the lock nut, so it must need to go further in. I thought it was pretty close, but if that washer's not hitting the aluminium face, it's not going to lock in place. Maybe another half turn. Right, that should do. We'll try it at that for just now. So again, remembering to get that slot parallel to the ground. And we'll put the nut on. So when you tighten it up, again bearing in mind that it needs to be parallel to the ground, you may need to hold it in position as you tighten the lock nut. There we go. Okay, so we're going to need the clutch push rod. Mine's a two-piece one, so I need this rounded end. All the other ends are square, so the rounded end needs to go nearest the clutch, and that should just slide in there. Then I've got my ball bearing, which is right here somewhere. Difficult to pick up with greasy fingers. So I've got my ball bearing, that is also going in there. And then the second rod, which has little dimples on either end because the ball bearing works against both ends, so that's going in as well, and it should go most of the way in, then come up against the clutch. And we may need to do some adjustment on the cover to make that fit properly to get a decent clutch action. Seeing if there's anything else I've forgotten. It's looking awfully close. So when I was talking about adjustment on the clutch, that's my clutch arm, and there's a lock nut and adjuster with a ball bearing on the inside that bears against the end of the push rod. So what I'm going to do is back that off, because it's quite tricky to get at when it's on the bike. So I'm going to just loosen this screw to move that cover plate. You can see when it's in there, you can only really get in with a socket and you can't get hold of much of the nut. So if I loosen it with it off the bike, I can get a spanner on it properly. So that's the lock nut loosened off. I'll just back this off a bit and then we can tighten it down to get the adjustment correct. So fast approaching, putting the cover back on. I'll just double check I have these posts properly tightened. Yes. Yes. And the nuts that cover it. Yes. And yes. So I'm going to thread the end of my clutch lever back through, my clutch cable. That goes back through this hole. Here it is. And it's worth checking that the outer hasn't moved out of the lever at the other end. That's looking good. Sometimes you find you can't get enough cable through and it's because it's got tangled up at the top end. So we're going to need to put this back on. So I need to put this clutch arm back onto the cable. Right, that's got hold of it. And then this whole assembly just slides back on. And we need to put our screws back in. That's the wrong one, straight off, wrong one. These two are long ones. Short. Short. Long. And long. And the one holding the cover, which is there. Put my big screwdriver down somewhere, if you just bear with me. That's these screws all tightened up now, so I'm going to adjust the clutch. So this adjuster here, I essentially screw it in until it starts to meet resistance, then fine adjustment with the lever end. So stand up to do this, and I find the best way to do it is to screw this in as you have your hand on the clutch lever. You'll feel the end of the slat and you'll feel the clutch lever moving out as you screw this in. Hopefully you can see that moving as I pull the lever. There's a tiny amount of free play on the clutch lever, but not a lot. That feels good. So now I need to tighten the lock nut. I might get it with a spanner. See, it's a little bit on the tricky side. It doesn't need to be hellish tight, it just needs to be tight enough to stop it unscrewing. it can actually be handy if you get it just right. If you find your clutch goes out of adjustment when you're on the road, to be able to turn this, but it having some resistance, it seems to work. I've been doing it for a long time. It's not the right way to use a clutch nut, but a clutch lock nut, but it does seem to broadly work. Now you may be wondering about what's on my covers. They're rupees for luck. You can do with all the luck you can get with these gearboxes. It didn't have a lot of luck, this one, it must be said. When it did break, it comprehensively smashed itself. There was a metal piece broke off inside and tried to go through two of the gears, which smashed the gear case and broke the end off the lay shaft, and it would now appear probably bent the main shaft as well. So we've had some excitement. I do like the alloy on these, so it cleans up beautifully. Oily alloy. Right, we need our neutral finder, which is a little bit mucky, so I'll just get the muck out of that. Okay, so round peg, a square peg in a round hole. There we are. Thrust washer. And then we've got the not sure what you'd call it, cup, pocket, something like that, that the spring sits in. So that goes over there, and then we have the central bolt, screws in. Socket. Now, I was finding that everything was very stiff if I tightened this fully home. So it may be that I'll leave it a little bit loose. We'll tighten it to start with anyway, but just tight. Yeah, that's very tight. So I'll back that off slightly, and that's much better. It doesn't seem to come undone anyway. The spring holds everything. You may need to adjust this at some point. That's just an eccentric adjuster, so when you use the neutral finder, that determines how far down the neutral finder goes. Now, what's interesting is I'm in neutral now, and it's not actually quite touching it, which I did find it was slightly over shifting. So I may adjust that very slightly now, because it doesn't seem to be in the right place. So we'll loosen this central bolt. That's screwed out. That spanner's not good. You can usually get an 11mm onto a Whitworth, but that one is not going to play ball. Got a 12 somewhere, but that's probably a bit too big. I may actually have. Oh no, we'll get away with it, I think. No. If you bear with me, I do have a Whitworth somewhere. Okay, that's my Whitworth spanner. That doesn't fit either. Hang on. Alright, so demonstration of what was needed of the joys of of Indian Enfields. I say I can usually get an 11mm spanner on these, but that's too tight. 12's far too loose. It should be a Whitworth, and there's a 1/4 Whitworth, and that's not even close. So adjustable it is. So we don't really know what size that thing is. So I'm just going to rotate this adjuster till it does actually have a hex on the adjuster as well, which I think I need my 15mm spanner for. This is, as I say, one of the joys of Enfields. There we go. So I'm going to rotate that until it's in contact with the arm. It's just stopping in the neutral position, and then we'll tighten that back down. I could have this in the wrong place. This is really only something you can properly adjust or work out if it needs adjusting once you've got the engine running. So, you know, if you have it in third and it selects neutral, great. If it finishes up in second, you need to give it some more travel. If it finishes up in first, you need to give it a bit less travel. That's about the stretch of it. Yeah, okay, so next thing, we need to put oil in it. I'm going to do that before I've put the levers back on, so there's less of the way. So I'm going to take out the level screw. Alright. Come on out. Don't be shy. That's my level screw removed, and before I forget, we will put the drain screw back in so we don't put our new oil all over the workbench, which has happened before. Going back in. Again, braid engaged. It is quite a coarse thread into the alloy, but you don't want to over tighten it and strip the threads out. And we're going to need the filler screw out, is bigger than that. Come on, just hold it in your hand, Scott. Can't get that on. Again, bear with me, I need to find out. Oh, hang on, I had that Whitworth combination sitting about. It may be that. Nope. Okay, I'll just find another spanner. Oh, I didn't mention this grease nipple here. That's for greasing the pivot for the clutch control arm. So if you feel that's getting a bit stiff, just occasionally pop some grease in there. It was pretty greasy when I saw it there, so I'm happy enough with it. Okay, drain filler screw. It's a bit awkward to get at. That's that off, and I usually take the dipstick out as well because I've got an extended filler neck on this bike. It's kind of getting in the way of the gearbox. So we need a funnel, and we're going to fill it until oil starts to drip out of this hole here. And I'm going to be putting in just some junk oil. My gear oil has not arrived yet, so I'm going to put some junk engine oil in just to test it, and we'll call that a flush. And once I'm happy it's working, I'll drain that out and put in the proper gear oil. So I'm just going to use the end of a bottle of engine oil that I don't really want to put in the bike itself. So I'm putting the oil in now. My gearbox oil hasn't arrived, so I'm just going to fill it with the dregs of some filling station engine oil. It'll do for now to test it, to make sure it's getting all the gears, and we'll call that a flush, and I'll drain it out and put the gearbox oil in when it arrives. This stuff pours a lot more easily. If you are using the semi-fluid grease, that is really tricky to get in. You have to heat it up in a pan of boiling water on the stove to get it even runny enough to think about pouring. And it barely goes in through the hole in through the filler neck. I found the best way to get it in was to actually use an old-fashioned piston type grease gun. So actually suck the stuff up into the grease gun and then pump it in with the grease gun, and you go quite slowly because it will have a tendency to overfill before it starts to run out of the overflow. I see, I'm not going to get into the debate of which. There we go, that's me full. And we'll stick that screw back in before it makes too much of a mess. So that's the level screw reached. If I leave this thin engine oil in the gearbox, it will leak all over the place. It's not that well sealed, and I think it kind of relies on the oil being at least somewhat thick to keep it in where it's supposed to be. I particularly find, because I don't have the main stand on this bike, is if I've been for a long run and the gearbox oil's got very hot and thin, if I then park it on the side stand, there's a certain amount of oil will creep out along the main shaft sleeve and drip onto the ground under the bike. It doesn't happen when you're on a main stand because it's below that level. It's below the level of the sleeve. But yeah, there's fibre washers and things inside where the final drive sprocket attaches that are supposed to stop the oil getting out, but they're not particularly effective. Okay, so just a couple of things to do before we take this out and give it a test. We've got oil in it. I think we're getting all the gears. The clutch is working. We're going to need to put the filler screw back in. And there is that spanner. This doesn't need to be particularly tight, it just needs to not come off. Right. And we'll replace the gear shift on the shaft. Now, I had a funny one with this on one bike that I built. I could not understand why this bike would not change up. It was really weird, and I eventually realised that the lever, can you see that? Yeah, the lever was hitting the foot peg when I was trying to change up, so it wasn't getting enough of a swing, and I just needed to move it round one notch. So you probably want to be aware of that as well. It landed up sitting higher than I particularly found it comfortable on that bike, but that's where it had to be, and that's sometimes part of the joys of Enfield ownership. Things are not perfect, they're just how they have to be. That's our gear lever on, and we'll place our kickstart, which I will need to wedge open slightly to get it in. Let's get that horrible screwdriver abuse. Well, maybe we'll get away with it. Maybe we will. Didn't know it just fell off the other side, but something did. Right, that's my kickstart back on, and my kickstart bolt back through. And this is the last step. Certainly at this side, I actually need to adjust my clutch because I have a non-standard clutch on this, and I need to put the primary cover back on and fill the primary with oil to take it for a road test. So we are very much getting there. Although British Rail said that in the 1980s, and we don't seem to be much further on. So okay, second spanner, there we go. Get that nipped in tight because we don't want it slipping down that path lies danger. Good. So that's it all reassembled. Next job is a road test.